In the beginning of our journey, there exists an original wound. Something that happens in our childhood at the very beginning of this lifetime. There exists the original wound. And it's a wound of suffering. It's a wound of abandonment. It's the place where we did not feel seen and heard. It's the starting point for continuing that story, continuing to recreate that story over and over and over again. The story of abandonment, the story of suffering in whatever form that took. We spend the rest of our narrative, the rest of our moments in life recreating that feeling of suffering, that feeling of abandonment, that feeling of alone, that feeling of less than. And whatever the wound was, whatever it created within us, however it took form, brought with it, taught us ultimately the message that we are unlovable. And so we continue throughout the rest of our lives to recreate this moment. And we do this, we recreate this pain for ourselves in hopes that we can be seen and heard. We do it also to prove that we are ultimately, in fact, unlovable. Because that original wound became so real, became so time-consuming, took up so much space that it became our reality. It became our truth. And so we move forward looking for people, places, situations, events that support that we are unlovable, and ultimately supporting this deep need and desire to be seen and heard. And often this original wound was given to us, was created by, supported by our parents or someone close to us, someone that we trusted, someone that we relied on, someone that we needed. And so not only do we move forward supporting the suffering, recreating the suffering, but we do it with those closest to us. Often even bringing people in to be close to us, and then creating this moment of suffering that existed at the beginning of our story. Because it's not true to the story, it's not true to the timeline if we don't recreate it with someone close to us. Sure, we can create it in smaller little blips or narratives with strangers, people passing by, but the true story, the true wound of suffering happened with those closest to us. So we bring people in and then generate this story of suffering, ultimately to be seen and heard. And so in our journeys to become aware, to bring awareness to this pattern, to bring awareness to our own self-destruction, we have to bring awareness to the original wound. We have to bring awareness to our stories of suffering. And sometimes it takes us going back through our timeline to get to the original wound. Often we can't just jump back to that original place because we've blocked it out or it happened too early. It takes work, it takes effort to get there. And then also once we get there, we realize, oh, well, it happened in the womb. And it takes work to be able to travel back to your mother's womb and to witness your story there, to do energy healing there, to change that dynamic. And then it takes going back even further. Where were you before you stepped into this life? But to get back to that original wound, it takes us being able to travel back through our sufferings, and to bear witness, first and foremost, to ourselves, to acknowledge the suffering, to say, hey, that's okay. That's okay that we suffered. It's okay that we weren't seen and heard then. I see and hear you now in this moment. Just as me right now witnessing your stories of suffering. You're longing to be seen and heard. You're longing to not feel abandoned and alone. I see you each in those stories of suffering that you carry. And I encourage you to go back through your life and to stand strong and tender to yourselves and to bear witness to your own stories of suffering. And go back and go back and go back until you can get to that original wound. That place in your childhood where that little kid felt wrong, felt stupid, felt like too much, felt like not enough. Whatever the feeling was, that little kid that didn't feel lovable. And offer that kid non-judgment. You don't need to fix them. You don't need to change them. They exist perfectly as they are in whatever moment you find them. Offer them safety. Offer them non-judgment. Offer them unconditional love. That means love without changing. Love without fixing. Love without requirement. And then bring awareness to that moment of what that suffering looks like for you and how you have recreated that story along the way. And offer yourself non-judgment and unconditional love. Begin to share your stories of suffering. I have my stories of suffering. You have your stories of suffering. We all do. We all have the original wound. Every single one of us. And it's not a competition of whose is worse, whose is more severe. Because they were all severe for each one of us. And we're all recreating them. So in offering yourself non-judgment and unconditional love, acceptance around the recreation of this story, offer the same to those around you. That their stories, that the perceived moments of them bringing suffering into your life have nothing to do with you. They have to do with the original wound of a little kid seeking to be seen and heard. How can you cultivate space for yourself to be seen and heard? How can you cultivate space for your loved ones to be seen and heard? Because when we see and hear others, we see and hear ourselves. And our wounded little children can rest easy, knowing that they are safe, that they are loved, that they are lovable, and that they are seen and heard.